He fed Bigfoot every winter for 17 years, until it brought its family to meet him. I shouldn't be telling you this, but the cassette tapes hidden in that dog's collar prove every word. February 1987, Wallowa Mountains, Oregon. A retired Marine inherits a remote cabin. During a brutal blizzard that nearly kills him, someone or something saves his life with fresh split firewood that appears overnight. The Polaroid photo changes everything. 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, carrying wood like it understands charity. For 17 winters, they trade. Food for medicine, tools for protection, trust for impossible gifts, including his father's dog tags, lost in those mountains since 1953. Then, March 2004, the creature arrives with a female and child. She carries something wrapped in grass that proves humans aren't alone. 3 days later, military boots surround the cabin. Encrypted radios crackle. Genetic anomaly. Confirmed. The Marine vanished 2 months later, leaving only one question. What family did he choose in the end? The Wallowa Mountains in December don't forgive mistakes. That's what I kept telling myself as I steered my truck up the final stretch of logging road to my uncle's cabin, correction, my cabin now. 40 miles from the nearest town, the last 20 on dirt roads that turned to suggestions when the snow came. Duke, my German shepherd, pressed his nose against the passenger window, fogging it with each breath as the pines grew thicker and the sky grew darker. I'd been putting this off since the funeral in August. Uncle Roy had lived up here alone for 23 years after retiring from the Forest Service. And now, at 55, fresh from my own retirement from the Marines and a year into widowhood, I figured I understood why. Sometimes a man needs distance from everything that reminds him of what he's lost. The cabin materialized through the trees, exactly his way. I remembered from childhood visits, log construction, metal roof, stone chimney already threading smoke into the gray afternoon. Roy must have had someone checking on the place these past months. The woodshed stood packed with split pine and fir. The solar panels looked clean, and the water wheel in the creek still turned, feeding the batteries that would be my only power source. Duke bounded out when I opened the truck door, immediately marking his new territory while I stood there, breathing air so cold it made my teeth ache. The silence hit me harder than the temperature. Not quiet, silent. No traffic, no neighbors, no electrical hum. Just the creek muttering to itself and the occasional crack of a tree adjusting to the cold. Inside, Roy had left everything meticulously organized. Canned goods lined the pantry shelves with dates marked in his careful script. Firewood stacked beside the cast-iron stove. Winter supplies laid out like he expected someone to need them. On the kitchen table, a note in his handwriting. Frank, the generator's in the shed. Radio set up in the desk. Read the journals. Trust your instincts. The desk yielded an elaborate ham radio system, the kind serious operators use, with laminated frequency cards and a logbook dating back 15 years. But it was the journals that stopped me cold. Not 1 or 2 dozens, stored in a cedar chest, each leather-bound and dated. The earliest went back to 1962. I opened one at random. December 3rd, 1978. Strange night. Something walked the perimeter again. Duke, I'd forgotten he'd had a dog with the same name, wouldn't stop trembling. Found tracks by the woodpile come morning 18 inches. Clear toe marks. Measured them 3 times to be sure. Another entry. March, 1985. It took the meat, but left something in return. Deer antler, carved or worn smooth. Can't tell. Patterns in it that look almost intentional. Why would it trade? Page after page of observations, sketches, measurements. Maps marking locations. First contact. Winter feeding site. Do not approach nursing area. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it as an old man's isolation-fueled fantasy, but Roy had been the most grounded person I'd ever known. 30 years in the Forest Service, a naturalist who could identify every plant and track in these mountains. Duke's low growl pulled me from the journals. He stood at the window, hackles raised, staring into the darkening forest. I clicked off my flashlight and joined him. Nothing moved between the trees, but Duke's reaction was enough. In Vietnam, I had learned to trust a dog's instincts over my own. I found the locked shed Roy had mentioned. Inside, along with the generator, hung game cameras, night vision equipment, older than my military stuff but serviceable, and boxes of plaster for casting tracks. On the workbench, a note. They know I watch. They allow it. Respect the port. Boundaries, they'll respect yours. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound outside could have been wind, could have been wildlife, could have been something else. Duke stayed by my bed, alert but not alarmed, occasionally releasing those deep, rumbling warnings that German shepherds perfect. When dawn finally came, I made coffee and opened Roy's most recent journal, dated just 2 months before his death. The final entry was brief. 17 years of reciprocal observation. They're ready for someone new. I hope Frank remembers what his grandmother taught him about the old ones. Some knowledge skips generations for a reason. I set down the journal and looked out at the forest. Pristine snow between the trees unmarked except for the delicate tracks of deer. 40 miles from civilization, winter closing in, and my dead uncle's conviction that something impossible lived in these woods. Duke whined and pressed against my leg. "It's okay, boy," I told him. Not entirely. Sure, I believed it myself. We're home now. By February, I thought I'd found my rhythm. Wake before dawn, coffee, check the weather station, split wood, maintain the water wheel, hunt or fish when possible. Radio check at noon and 6, sleep by 9. A military schedule adapted to mountain isolation. Duke had adjusted too, learning the boundaries of our new territory, though he still refused to venture past certain trees, marking some invisible perimeter I couldn't see. Then the blizzard hit. The weather radio had warned about a system moving in, but mountain storms have their own rules. What started as manageable snowfall on February 10th became a white wall by evening. The wind gauge hit 60 before the anemometer froze. Temperature dropped to -25 during the day, probably -40 at night with wind chill. By day 3, I couldn't open the front door. Snow had drifted to the roof on that side. The back door still worked, but stepping outside meant fighting through chest-deep powder just to reach the woodshed. Power held thanks to the batteries, but the water wheel had frozen solid. I switched to conservation mode. One room heated, minimal cooking, melting snow for water. Duke changed on day 5. My steady companion, trained to alert without panic, began pacing the cabin at night, growling at corners where nothing existed. Not his sharp warning bark for actual threats, but a deep, continuous rumble that seemed to come from some ancestral memory. He'd press against my legs, trembling, then suddenly rush to a window and stand rigid, watching something I couldn't see through the frost and darkness. The woodpile became my hourglass. I'd stocked the indoor rack before the storm, but heating even one room ate through logs faster than expected. Old cabins leak heat through 1,000 gaps. By day 10, I was down to maybe 3 days of wood inside, and the path to the woodshed had become a tunnel through 8-foot drifts that collapsed as fast as I could dig. That night, February 20th, according to my log, though isolation makes time elastic exhaustion finally won. Duke's constant anxiety had kept me on edge for days. When I finally passed out in the chair beside the stove, I slept like the dead. Duke's frantic barking yanked me awake. Not his warning growl or defensive stance, but pure, primal alarm. He stood at the window, front paws on the sill, barking with an intensity that made the glass rattle. The clock showed 3:15 a.m. Outside, the storm had finally quieted to light snowfall. "Duke, enough!" But he wouldn't stop, wouldn't even look at me. Then, as suddenly as he'd started, he went silent. Not calm, silent. He dropped to all fours and backed away from the window, pressing himself against my legs, trembling so hard I could hear his tags rattling. In 20 years of working with military dogs, I'd never seen one react like that. These animals face gunfire, explosions, combat, zones. But Duke looked like he'd glimpsed something that violated the natural order. I grabbed my flashlight and the M1 Garand, though my hands shook from more than cold. At the window, I scraped frost from the glass and peered out. The beam of my flashlight penetrated maybe 10 feet into the falling snow. Nothing moved, no tracks visible from this angle. But the woodpile, my throat went dry. The splitting stump beside the woodshed, barely visible through the snow, held fresh logs, stacked logs, cut to stove length, bark still weeping sap despite the sub-zero temperature. I'd checked that spot at sunset while fighting to get one last armload. It had been empty, buried under undisturbed snow. Now, at least 2 cords stood stacked with military precision, the ends facing out like I'd done it myself. Steam rose from the fresh cuts. "That's not possible," I said aloud, needing to hear my own voice. Duke whined and pressed harder against me. I stayed at that window until dawn, rifle ready, watching for movement. Nothing. When full daylight finally came, I forced myself to suit up and investigate. Duke absolutely refused to come outside, the first time he'd ever disobeyed a direct command. The tracks told the story my mind didn't want to read. They came from the forest, followed the tree line to the woodshed, then circled to the stump. Bare feet in sub-zero weather, 18 inches long, maybe longer where the snow had compressed. 5 toes clearly visible, a stride that suggested a height well over 7 feet. But what made my military mind revolt wasn't the tracks themselves, it was the pattern. Whatever made them had approached tactically, using tree cover, checking sight lines to the cabin windows. It had carried probably 500 pounds of wood through chest-deep snow without dropping a piece, then retreated using a different route, minimizing its track exposure. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't split wood, they don't stack it, they don't calculate angles of observation. I stood there in the brutal cold, staring at those impossible tracks, already filling with fresh snow, and remembered Roy's journal entry. They know I watch. They allow it. The wood was real. Dry, perfectly split, ready to burn. A gift that had saved my life as surely as any combat medic. Inside, Duke had finally calmed, curled by the stove, but watching me with those intelligent brown eyes. "Yeah, boy," I said, adding the fresh wood to the fire. "I know. Everything just changed." That night, I read Roy's journals until my eyes burned, looking for patterns, for rules, for any explanation that didn't sound insane. One phrase appeared again and again: reciprocal exchange. Outside, the storm began to break, and somewhere in those mountains, something that shouldn't exist was watching my cabin, waiting to see what I'd do next. The Polaroid camera had been sitting in Roy's shed since 1978, according to the date scratched on its case. Still worked, though the flash took forever to charge in the cold. I rigged it with fishing line across the most likely approach route, the path those tracks had taken from the forest to the woodpile. My hands shook, setting it up, and not from the temperature. 20 years of combat reconnaissance in Vietnam had taught me about ambush positions, sight lines, tracking, but this went against every instinct. When you identify a potential threat, you investigate, you engage, you neutralize. You don't set up a camera and wait. Yet something in Roy's journals, in the careful way he documented rather than confronted, made me hold back. 3 nights passed. Nothing. Duke had returned to his normal watchful state, though he still wouldn't go near the woodpile after dark. I'd started leaving the offerings Roy had described: venison scraps, dried apples, even some of Roy's moonshine I'd found in the root cellar. Each morning the food was gone, but no tracks, no triggers, nothing. The 4th night, February 27th, I woke to silence. Not the normal mountain quiet where you can still hear the creek, the wind, the house settling. This was the silence that comes before an artillery strike, when even the insects know to stop moving. Duke was standing beside my bed, pressed against my legs, not growling, not whining, just standing there, trembling, his whole body rigid with a kind of terror I'd never seen in him. The silence pressed against my eardrums like depth pressure. Then the flash exploded outside. The sudden burst of white light through the window made us both jump. Duke let out a single, sharp yelp and pressed harder against me. I grabbed the rifle and my flashlight, but something made me wait. Count to 60. Count to 120. Let whatever was out there believe it was safe. When I finally went to the window, nothing moved in the darkness. But I could feel it, that sensation of being observed that every soldier knows, the weight of eyes that shouldn't be there. I waited until dawn, Duke never leaving my side, never making another sound. When the sun finally hit the trees, I suited up and went out, leaving Duke inside despite his whines. The camera had been triggered. The fishing line snapped clean. And there, in the snow, fresh tracks leading to and from the woodpile. But these weren't moving away in haste like an animal spooked by a flash. They paused, turned toward the cabin, toward my bedroom window specifically, then continued to the woodpile before heading back into the forest. My mouth went dry when I retrieved the Polaroid. Most of it was blown out by the flash against the snow, but there in the right side of the frame, clear as could be, was a figure, massive, covered in dark hair that looked almost black in the stark light. Mid-stride, carrying what had to be 100 pounds of split wood like I'd carry a grocery bag, but it was the eyes that made me sit down right there in the snow. They reflected the flash like any nocturnal animals would, except they were too high, 8 feet at least, and they were looking directly at the camera. Not startled, not angry, aware, intelligent, curious. I studied that photo until my eyes burned. The proportions were wrong for a human: arms too long, torso too thick, head shaped differently, though the features were obscured by hair. But the posture, the way it carried the wood, the deliberate placement of its feet to minimize sound, this thing understood stealth, purpose, tools. Back inside, I compared the photo to Roy's sketches. The similarities were undeniable. Whatever this was, it had been here for decades at least, living alongside us, hidden, watching, and now it knew I was watching back. That night, I left a larger offering, a whole venison roast, still warm from the oven, and a 6-pack of beer I'd been saving. I added something else, a note written large and clear, just 2 words. Thank you. I don't know if it could read. Probably not. But somehow, leaving that acknowledgement felt necessary. Like the first word in a conversation that didn't need language. Duke whined when I came back inside, pressing his nose into my palm. I know, boy, I said, looking at the photo again. Everything we thought we knew just changed. The next morning, the food was gone. So was the note. But in its place, stuck upright in the snow, was a single eagle feather, perfect and unmistakable. The kind my Cherokee grandmother had said could only be gifted, never taken. I stood there in the February cold, holding that feather, understanding that I just entered into something ancient and careful. A contract written in exchanges rather than words. And once you start something like that in these mountains, you don't stop. Not if you want to survive the winter, not if you want to earn what comes next. The fever hit me 2 days after the feather appeared. Came on fast, fine at breakfast, shaking with chills by noon, barely able to keep the fire going by nightfall. Temperature spiked to 103, maybe higher. No way to get help, roads still buried, radio crackling with static from another storm system moving in. Duke stayed close, whining when I struggled to add wood to the stove. By the second day, I couldn't get out of bed. Kept drifting in and out, dreaming about my father's hunting trip in '53, the one he never came back from. Mom had said he'd gotten lost in a storm. But in the fever dreams, I saw him walking into these same woods, following something tall and dark, looking back once before disappearing into the trees. Woke up on day 3 to Duke licking my face. The fever had broken. But more than that, the cabin was warm. The fire I'd let die was roaring. Fresh wood stacked beside the stove. And on the table, arranged carefully, were things that shouldn't be there. Pine needle tea in my own mug, still steaming. A compress of moss and herbs I didn't recognize. 3 roots, cleaned and peeled, that looked like ginseng but smelled different. The door was still locked from the inside. I drank the tea. What choice did I have? Bitter, medicinal, but it helped. The roots, too, though they numbed my tongue. By evening, I could stand, walk, think clearly. Whatever had been in those remedies worked better than anything from my military medkit. That's when I found Roy's hidden journals, the ones he'd kept separate from the others, behind a false panel in the bedroom closet, wrapped in oilcloth. These went back further, his father's entries from the 30s and 40s, and loose pages that looked even older, written in Cherokee syllabary. Roy's father had written about an agreement, a pact made during the Depression when the family nearly starved. Food appeared when they needed it most, firewood when they were freezing, medicine when the children were sick. In exchange, they left offerings, kept the secret, and, most importantly, never brought outsiders to certain parts of the forest. One entry from 1941 stood out. They showed themselves today, the whole family. 2 adults, 3 young. They're not animals, not human either. Something between or alongside. They know we're watching, have always known. The question is why they allow it. I started mapping the encounters, cross-referencing Roy's observations with his father's, looking for patterns. They appeared more during harsh winters. Breeding season seemed to be late spring. They avoided the full moon but were active during new moon phases. And they had territories, specific areas they'd defend, others they'd share, and neutral zones where exchanges could happen. The offering site Roy had marked was one of those neutral zones. About 300 yards from the cabin, a flat area between 2 massive Douglas firs. That's where I'd been leaving food, finding gifts. But according to the maps, their actual territory started another half-mile in, marked by old-growth trees with claw marks 15 feet up higher than any bear could reach. March came in warmer, melting enough snow to make walking easier. I expanded my offerings: smoked fish, salt, sugar, coffee beans. The gifts in return grew more extraordinary. obsidian tools that looked fresh napped but in a style no local tribe had used for centuries, medicinal plants that only grew at much higher elevations. Once, a handful of gold nuggets that I immediately buried, understanding they were showing me they had no use for what men killed each other over. Then came the morning that stopped my heart. I'd left the usual offering under the twin firs. When I returned the next day, sitting in the snow beside the empty basket was something impossible. My father's dog tags. Thomas Franklin Coulter, serial number intact, the chain broken but the tags themselves pristine. These had been lost with him in 1953, somewhere in these mountains. His body never recovered. I stood there for an hour, tags clenched in my fist, trying to process what this meant. They'd been here when my father disappeared. They knew what had happened to him. And now they were telling me they knew. That night I wrote in my own journal, continuing the family record. They're not just watching us. They're remembering us. Generation to generation, they know who we are, where we came from, what we've lost. The question isn't whether they exist, it's why they've chosen us to know they exist. Duke had long since stopped reacting to their presence. He'd lay by the fire when the tree knocks announced their approach, alert but calm. Sometimes I'd catch him watching the tree line with what looked like recognition, like he was seeing old friends keeping their distance. The next full moon, I left something different at the offering site. Not food or tools, but a photograph, one of the few I had of my father, taken the year before he died. I weighted down, with a river stone, and walked away. 3 days later, it was back on my porch, but now there were 2 stones holding it down. Underneath the photo was a small piece of bark with marks scratched into it. Not random, deliberate, patterned, like a map. It took me a week to understand what they were showing me. A cave system, 2 miles northeast, and at the center of the pattern, a symbol that could only mean one thing, grave. They were offering to show me where my father was buried. The map made from scratches on bark led me through terrain I thought I knew. 2 miles northeast meant crossing Copper Creek and climbing the ridge where the old growth started. But their route was different. It followed game trails invisible under snow, wound through stands of pine so thick the noon sun barely penetrated. Duke came with me this first time, though he stayed pressed against my leg whenever we stopped. At a massive cedar with claw marks exactly where the bark map indicated, I found the next marker, stones arranged in an arrow pointing upslope. Then another 50 yards on, sticks crossed in an X beside a specific boulder. They were guiding me, step by step, to something they'd kept hidden for 34 years. The cave entrance was concealed behind a fall of vine, maple, and devil's club, painful to push through unless you knew the one clear path. Inside, the temperature jumped 10 degrees. Not a cave, really, more of a cleft in the rock that went back 20 feet, just tall enough for me to stand upright. At the back, covered carefully with fitted stones, was a grave. I knew it was my father before I moved a single rock. His compass sat on top of the cairn, the one Mom had given him for their anniversary. Still worked, still pointing north. They'd buried him with dignity stones placed with purpose, not just piled. Beside the grave, protected under an overhang, were his pack, his rifle, and something that made me sink to my knees. A row of gifts. Feathers, polished stones, antler carvings. Years' worth. They'd been visiting his grave, leaving offerings like you would for family. I found his journal in the pack, pages water-damaged but readable. The final entry was February 15th, 1953. Storm coming in fast, trails gone. Following something big, tracks like nothing in any field guide. It's watching me, I know it, not stalking, leading. If I don't make it back, tell Marie I loved her. Tell Frankie his dad tried to come home. Under that, in different handwriting, larger, cruder, but deliberate, someone had added symbols. The same patterns I'd been seeing on trees, the same marks on the bark map. Then, at the bottom, scratched in English so rough, it must have taken tremendous effort. He did not suffer. I sat in that cave until the light started fading, reading Dad's journal, understanding piece by piece what had happened. He'd gotten lost in a whiteout. Hypothermia had taken him the peaceful way, where you just go to sleep. And they'd found him, carried him here, buried him properly. Then spent 3 decades tending his grave. Watto, I said aloud, thank you, in Cherokee. The only word my grandmother made sure I never forgot. The cave seemed to hold the word, echo it back softer. On the hike back, following their markers in reverse, I found fresh tracks paralleling mine, staying exactly 30 yards to my left, maintaining perfect pace. Duke noticed too, but showed no fear now, just that alert acceptance he'd developed. They were escorting us out, making sure we made it back safe. That night, I made my decision. At the offering site, I left more than food. I left a response written in block letters on birch bark. I understand, friends. The next morning, beside the empty basket, 3 perfect eagle feathers stood upright in the snow, and carved into the tree above them in letters that must have taken hours with claws not meant for such work. Friends. Duke sniffed the past, carving, tail wagging slightly for the first time since we'd arrived. Spring was coming. The snow would melt, the roads would open, and I'd have to decide whether to stay or go. But looking at those roughly carved letters, feeling my father's compass in my pocket, I already knew my answer. Some connections run deeper than blood. Some families you're born into. Others find you in the woods, save your life with firewood, and teach you that the world holds more mysteries than any field guide could ever contain. I added a new entry to our family journal that night. The pact continues, 3rd generation confirmed. They remember us all. 13 years changes a man. By the year 2000, I was 68, and Duke had been gone for 3 winters. Buried him under the twin firs where we'd made our exchanges, and the next morning found wildflowers on his grave species that didn't bloom for another 2 months. Never saw who left them, but I knew. Got a new dog from town, another German Shepherd I called Duchess. She took to the routine faster than Duke had, like the knowledge passed between dogs somehow. By her 2nd winter, she'd learned to sleep through the tree knocks, barely lifting her head when Old-Timer announced his approach. That's what I'd started calling him in '92, when I'd realized he was ancient. Gray streaked through the dark hair on his face, movements still powerful but more deliberate. How old? I couldn't guess, but the scars on his body told stories of decades, maybe centuries. One, across his chest, looked like a bullet wound, old and puckered. Another on his thigh might have been from a trap. He'd survived things that would have killed anything else. We developed a rhythm over the years. Exchanges every 3rd night in winter, once a week in summer. The gifts had become more practical. He'd leave medicinal plants before I even knew I was getting sick. I'd leave antibiotics when I noticed him favoring one leg. Once, during the bad winter of '96, he'd left a whole elk haunch, fresh killed, when my freezer had died and I'd lost all my stored meat. I'd learned their patterns. 3 distinct knocks meant approaching, friendly. Rapid knocks meant danger, stay inside. A long howl that sounded almost like wind meant gathering, do not follow. They had a whole language in those sounds, complex as any human speech. The millennium came and went without the world ending, despite what the radio preachers predicted. But Old-Timer's behavior started changing around then. More careful, checking behind him constantly. The offerings came at irregular times. Sometimes he'd leave them and vanish so fast I'd only know he'd been there by Duchess's sudden alertness. August 2001, everything shifted. I was splitting wood when the tree knocks came middle of the day. Unprecedented. Not the friendly pattern either. Short, sharp, urgent. Duchess went stiff, then did something she'd never done. Grabbed my sleeve in her teeth and pulled me toward the cabin. I listened to her, locked the door, grabbed the rifle, watched through the window. Nothing for an hour. Then movement, not Old-Timer, but 3 hikers, way off trail, heading straight for the offering site. They had equipment that didn't match their casual clothes. Radio antennas, camera with telephoto lens, something that looked like recording equipment. They spent an hour at the site, taking photos of the scratches on trees, making casts of old tracks I'd missed. Professional, methodical, looking for something specific. They left before dark, but the damage was done. Old-Timer didn't come for 2 weeks. When he finally returned, the offering was different, not food or medicine, but a warning. A human skull, ancient from the look of it, placed carefully beside a modern hiking boot, torn in half with impossible strength. The message was clear. We've dealt with intruders before. I started paying more attention to the radio chatter, the Forest Service frequencies. Hikers were going missing, just 1 or 2 a year, but always in specific areas. Search teams would find camps abandoned, sometimes tracks that didn't make sense, but never bodies. The official reports blamed bears, weather, inexperience, but I knew better now. They were protecting their territory, had been for generations. And anyone who came looking for them specifically, anyone who threatened their secret, simply disappeared. That fall, I found their boundary markers trees twisted into impossible shapes, grown that way over decades to mark the edges of their domain. Inside those boundaries were birthing dens, gathering places, burial grounds maybe, sacred spaces they'd killed to protect. Old-timer's next gift confirmed my suspicion. A Forest Service badge, bent nearly in half, the name worn off, but the number still visible. I looked it up later, a ranger who'd gone missing in '78, officially listed as presumed dead, fell while climbing. He'd been investigating unusual wildlife patterns, according to his last report. I burned the badge and made my own offering, my military dog tags, the ones I'd worn through Vietnam. Leaving them meant something I couldn't put into words. Not surrender, not alliance, exactly. Recognition. Respect between warriors who'd both done what was necessary to protect their people. The next morning, my tags hung from the offering tree, polished to a shine I hadn't seen since boot camp. But now, they were on a new chain, woven from something that looked like hair but felt stronger than steel. I wore them every day after that. A reminder of the pact I'd entered into, and a warning to anyone who might come looking that I was under protection, that I belonged to the forest now as much as any human could. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some secrets are worth killing for. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very cursed, you get to stand on that border between worlds. Translator for neither side, but trusted by both. The 21st century had arrived, but in these mountains, the old rules still applied. The missing hiker's name was Tyler Morrison, 22, from Portland. Experienced enough to know better than to go off trail alone. When search and rescue showed up at my cabin on day 3 of the search, I knew things were about to get complicated. Ranger Patricia Moss led the team. Mid-30s, competent, the kind who'd grown up in these mountains. She had that look of someone who'd seen enough to know the official explanations didn't always add up. Duke, I'd gotten another German Shepherd after Duchess passed. Kept the naming tradition, watched her from the porch, not hostile but alert. "Mr. Coulter," she said, checking her notebook. "Frank Coulter? You've been up here since '87? "That's right. Long time to be alone." She studied me, taking in the maintained cabin, the organized woodpile, the fact that I looked healthier at 69 than most men did at 50. "We're searching for a missing hiker, last seen 4 days ago near Cave Creek. Cave Creek, the main exchange site." My poker face must have slipped because her eyes sharpened. "You know the area?" "I trap there sometimes," I said, keeping my voice level. "Haven't been over in a couple weeks, though." She nodded slowly, but I could see her filing that reaction away. "Any unusual wildlife activity lately? Bears coming out of hibernation early, anything like that?" "Nothing unusual." The lie came smooth, automatic. 17 years of practice. "Mind if we use your cabin as a waypoint? Teams might need water, radio relay." No good way to refuse without raising suspicion. "Sure, coffee's always on." For 2 days, searchers tramped through my territory. I watched them from the window, noting their patterns, their blind spots, professional but missing things. They walked right past tree marks, 15 feet up, stepped over tracks that their minds refused to process correctly. One searcher actually photographed some old claw marks, then deleted the image, shaking his head like he was seeing things. Moss came back on day 3, alone this time. Duke led her onto the porch, which surprised me. He usually had better judgment about threats. "Found something interesting near Cave Creek," she said, pulling out her phone. Trail camera from another case caught this 2 nights ago. The image was blurry, taken at night with infrared, but the shape was unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Tall, bipedal, caught mid-stride at the edge of the frame. She watched my face carefully. "Black bear," I said. "Standing up, they do that. That's what my supervisor said." She put the phone away. Funny thing, though, the height markers on that tree put it at 8 feet minimum. We stared at each other for a long moment. She was testing me, feeling out what I knew. I kept my expression, neutral, but something must have shown because she nodded slightly, like I'd confirmed something. "If you see anything unusual, Mr. Coulter, you'll call it in?" "Of course." She left, but I knew she'd be back. That night, the tree knocks came, not the friendly pattern, but the warning one. Rapid, aggressive, moving in a circle around the cabin. Duke crawled under the bed, something he'd never done before. In the morning, I found the message. Claw marks on 7 trees, forming a perimeter about 200 yards from the cabin. Fresh, deep, angry. And at the base of each marked tree, a human item. A boot, a water bottle, a torn piece of jacket, Tyler Morrison's gear, but no body. Never a body when someone got too close to their secrets. Old Timer didn't come to the exchange site for 2 weeks. When he finally returned, he left something that made my blood run cold. A digital camera, the expensive kind Morrison had been carrying. The memory card was missing, but the lens was cracked in a very specific way, crushed by something with an opposable thumb. The search was called off after 2 weeks. Morrison joined the long list of people who'd simply vanished in these mountains. Moss came by one last time, officially to inform me the search was over. You know, she said carefully, my grandfather used to tell stories about these woods. Said there were places you didn't go, things you didn't talk about. Said the old families who'd been here longest knew to leave certain offerings, maintain certain boundaries. I said nothing, but she saw the dog tags around my neck, the ones on the chain that wasn't quite hair and wasn't quite anything identifiable. Those aren't military issue, she observed. Family heirloom, I said. She looked at me for a long moment, then handed me her card. If you ever want to talk off the record about what's really in these mountains, I'll listen. My grandfather would have wanted me to. After she left, I found Old Timer's response to her visit. A single word carved fresh into the offering tree. Careful. I didn't know if it was a warning to me or about her. Maybe both. The coyote should have killed Duke. I found it 50 yards from the cabin on a September morning, neck twisted at an impossible angle, teeth still bared in its final snarl. Duke was inside, sleeping peacefully, not a mark on him. But the tracks told the story. Duke's prints led from the cabin to where the coyote lay. But paralleling them, keeping exactly 3 feet to the right, were the other tracks. Massive, bare, moving in perfect synchronization with my dog's path. Like a bodyguard. The coyote's tracks showed it charging from the brush, then a scatter of dirt where something had intercepted it mid-leap. One strike, precise as a sniper's bullet. I'd started noticing other things that summer of 2002. Wolf packs that circled the property but never entered. A mountain lion that had been stalking my clearing for 3 nights, according to its tracks, until it suddenly vanished, only a tuft of fur and some blood drops marking where it had been discouraged from hunting here. Old Timer was protecting us. Not just me, us. It went deeper than that. I'd been documenting his tool use for years, but that fall I saw something that challenged everything I thought I knew about him. I was glassing the far hillside, watching for elk, when movement by the creek caught my eye. Old Timer stood in the shallow rapids, perfectly still. In his hand was a spear, not a sharpened stick, but a crafted tool. The shaft was straight, selected for balance. The point wasn't just sharp, but barbed, carved with backward-facing hooks. He'd attached it to the shaft with some kind of wrapped binding, maybe sinew, but it was how he used it that stopped my breath. He waited, patient as a heron, reading the water. When he struck, it was economical, precise. The salmon never saw it coming. One motion to spear, another to bring it to hand, a third to kill it cleanly with a bite to the head, exactly where commercial fishermen would spike them. He caught 4 more in 20 minutes, then did something that made me set down the binoculars and reconsider everything. He laid the fish on a flat rock and opened them with a sharp stone, not randomly, but following the anatomy, like he'd done it 1,000 times. Removed the organs carefully, sorted some into one pile, others into another. The swim bladders he punctured and set aside, I'd later learn they could be processed into waterproof glue. The precision suggested not just intelligence, but culture, inherited knowledge, generations of refinement. October brought another revelation. I'd left him tools over the years, knives, matches, even a folding saw once. They'd always been returned, sometimes modified to accommodate larger hands. But that month, he left me something extraordinary, a knife he'd made. The blade was napped, obsidian, sharper than any steel, with edges so fine you could shave with it. But the handle was what made me sit down hard on a stump. It was carved from antler, shaped to fit a human hand perfectly, with a thumb rest and finger grooves exactly where mine naturally fell. He'd wrapped it with the same unusual fiber his chain was made from, creating a non-slip grip. He'd studied how I held tools and made this specifically for me. I used that knife to field dress a deer the next week, and it worked better than anything from a sporting goods store. The edge never dulled, The balance was perfect, and the grip felt like it had been molded to my palm, which, in a way, it had. The exchanges evolved that winter. Instead of just food and trinkets, we started trading knowledge. I'd leave books, picture books at first, then field guides, anatomy texts. They'd disappear and return weeks later, sometimes with pine pitch fingerprints on certain pages. The medical texts especially seemed to interest him. Pages about pregnancy, childhood development, genetic conditions, these showed the most wear. One night I left a solar calculator, the kind engineers used. Figured he'd be interested in the buttons, maybe the little solar panel. When it came back, it had been used. The calculation history showed mathematical operations, not random button pushing, but actual equations. Distance calculations, from what I could tell, possibly territory measurements. But the moment that really changed my understanding came during the first snow. I was watching the exchange site from the cabin when Oldtimer arrived. He placed his offerings, winter roots, dried meat, then stood there, waiting, not leaving immediately like usual. Then he did something unprecedented. He took a stick and drew in the snow. Simple shapes, at first circles, lines, then more complex. A rough map, I realized. Mountains, the creek, the cabin. He marked spots with X's, then pointed at one X, then at me, then at the X again. He was warning me about something, showing me places to avoid. I copied his map into my journal and compared it to my topographical maps. The X's corresponded to new logging roads being cut by a company from Seattle. Areas that had been wilderness were about to become accessible. His territory was being invaded, and he was trusting me with the knowledge of where his vulnerable points were. I left him a message in return, using charcoal on birch bark. I will help. The next morning, fresh tracks circled the cabin 3 times. Not hunting, not searching. Celebrating, maybe. Or blessing. My Cherokee grandmother would have called it a protection circle, marking me as family. The war for territory was coming, and somehow I'd become his scout in the human world. Not what I'd expected from retirement, but then nothing about these 17 years had gone according to plan. The winter of 2003 started wrong. October, too warm. November, too dry. Then December hit like a sledgehammer, temperatures dropping 40 degrees overnight, snow falling sideways. But it wasn't the weather that had me worried. It was Oldtimer's behavior. He'd started coming to the exchange site every night instead of every third, not taking the offerings, just adding to them. Massive amounts, whole deer haunches, garbage bags worth of pine nuts, gallons of rendered fat in containers I'd never seen before, made from some kind of processed bladder. At first I thought he was worried about my age. 71 isn't young, and the cold was getting harder on my joints every year. But Duke knew better. He'd started sleeping by the door, facing out, ears always half-cocked, the kind of watching he used to do in those first years, when everything was unknown and dangerous. The tree knocks changed, too. Not announcements anymore, but conversations. Rapid exchanges from different directions, sometimes 3 or 4 voices. They were gathering, planning, discussing. An Oldtimer kept looking past me during our exchanges, watching the tree line with an intensity that reminded me of Walking Point in Vietnam. That hyper-alert state where every shadow could be death. 2 days before Christmas, I understood. I was checking my trap lines when I found the print. Not Oldtimer's. I knew his gait, the specific way his left foot turned slightly inward. This was different. Bigger, heavier, with a longer stride. Another male, fully grown, and he'd been circling my territory for days based on the age of the tracks. That night, Oldtimer left something new. A warning. 3 rocks stacked in a pyramid, with claw marks on the tree above deep, aggressive gouges that seeped pitch. In Cherokee tradition, my grandmother would have called it a war marker. Someone was challenging for territory, and my cabin sat right in the disputed zone. I started carrying the gerund everywhere, though I knew it was mostly for my own comfort. What good would bullets do against something that could twist a coyote's neck, like opening a bottle? But Oldtimer seemed to approve. He left me extra ammunition, old military surplus he'd found somewhere, the brass green, with age but still functional. January brought the confrontation. 3 a.m., Duke going absolutely berserk, throwing himself at the door. I grabbed the rifle and looked out the window. In the moonlight, 2 figures faced off near the woodpile. Oldtimer and the newcomer, circling each other with the careful precision of fighters who knew one mistake meant death. The challenger was younger, unscarred, maybe 9 feet tall. He moved like coiled violence, all quick twitches and aggressive displays. Old-timer moved differently, economical, experienced, wasting nothing. When the young one charged, Old-timer sidestepped and struck once, a hammer fist to the ribs that sent the challenger stumbling. But the younger one kept coming. They grappled, and for the first time, I heard Old-timer vocalize not quite a roar, more like a deep bass note that I felt in my chest. The challenger answered with his own call, higher, more desperate. Then she appeared. The female, Old-timer's mate, emerged from the trees carrying something small against her chest. The juvenile from before, but also something else, something tiny. A newborn, barely visible in the bundle of fur she carried. The challenger saw them and hesitated. That moment of distraction was all Old-timer needed. He didn't kill the youngster, could have, but didn't. Instead, he grabbed him by the throat, lifted him clear off the ground, and carried him to the tree line. The message clear: leave and live. The challenger fled, crashing through the forest with none of the usual stealth. Old-timer stood guard until the sounds faded, then turned back to his family. The female touched his face, a gesture so human it made my throat tight, then melted back into the forest with the young Old-timer approached my cabin, closer than he'd ever come. He stood at my window, looking directly at me through the glass. His eyes in the moonlight were ancient, tired, but determined. He placed one massive hand against the window, holding it there for 3 breaths. I placed my palm against the glass, matching his. A promise. Whatever came next, we'd face it as allies. He left extra supplies that night, medicine plants, preserved meat, even what looked like a primitive antibiotic made from mold, preparing me for siege. Because we both knew the challenger would be back, and he wouldn't come alone. March 2004. 17 years of secrets, about to shatter with a single visit. I was repairing the chicken coop when Duke started his warning whine, not the sharp alert for danger, but the uncertain sound he made for something unprecedented. Through the trees came Old-timer, moving with deliberate slowness, each step calculated to appear non-threatening. Behind him, barely visible, 2 more figures. My hands started trembling. Not from fear, from the magnitude of what was happening. In all our years of exchange, he'd never brought them this close. Old-timer stopped at the usual spot, but instead of leaving offerings and retreating, he sat down. Just folded those massive legs and sat in the snow, hands visible on his knees, waiting. The smaller female emerged next, moving with extraordinary grace despite her size, 7 feet maybe, covered in lighter brown hair that looked almost auburn in the morning sun. She stayed 30 yards back, and from behind her legs, a face peeked out. The juvenile was maybe 4 feet tall, covered in downy hair like a bear cub's. Its eyes were enormous, taking up more of its face than an adult's would. It clung to its mother's leg but watched me with open curiosity rather than fear. When I didn't move, didn't raise the rifle, it took a half step forward before the mother's hand gently pulled it back. Old-timer made a gesture I'd never seen, hand to chest, then extended toward me, then toward his family. Introduction. Formal presentation. This is mine. These are mine. You are. What? The gesture hung incomplete, waiting for my response. I set down my tools, moved slowly to the porch steps, and sat, mirroring his position. Then I repeated his gesture, hand to chest, to him, to them. Adding one more movement, hand to heart, the Cherokee sign for family my grandmother had taught me. The female made a sound soft, almost musical. She reached into a woven grass bag at her side and pulled something out, placed it on the ground, then retreated to her original position. Old-timer stood, gestured for me to approach. The bundle was wrapped in grass, so finely woven it felt like cloth. Inside was impossible, an infant, but wrong. Partially human in its features, the nose, the mouth, the shape of its hands, but covered in fine dark hair, with elongated fingers and toes, a skull that protruded slightly backward. Its eyes were closed, had never opened. Stillborn. I understood immediately what this meant. The trust it took to show me this. The vulnerability. But also the question underneath, what are we to each other? What are we becoming? The infant was answer and mystery both. Proof that our kinds were closer than anyone imagined, yet still separated by some unbridgeable biological gulf. The female watched as I examined her lost child. Her eyes, brown, intelligent, devastated, held mine. Mother to parent, the grief universal. I'd lost my own son in Vietnam, never got to hold him, never got to bury him properly. She saw that somehow, in my reaction, in the careful way I rewrapped her baby, I made a decision. pointed to the cabin, then to a spot behind it where the morning sun hit first. Made digging motions, then placed my hands in prayer position. Burial. Proper burial. She looked to Oldtimer, who looked to me for a long moment. Then he nodded, a human gesture he'd learned from years of watching. I buried the infant that afternoon while they watched from the trees. Used my dress uniform, folded the flag properly, even played taps on my harmonica. Duke howled along, mournful and perfect. The female crept closer during the ceremony, close enough that I could hear her breathing, see tears, actual tears, on her face. When I placed the last stone on the small grave, she approached. Slow, careful, but deliberate. She towered over me, could have crushed me without effort. Instead, she placed something in my hands, a lock of hair, tied with that same impossible fiber from the infant, for remembrance. Then she did something that broke me. She spoke. One word, harsh and difficult around vocal cords not designed for human speech, but clear. Free end. Oldtimer took her arm, gentle but insistent, and they melted back into the forest. The juvenile looked back once, raised its hand in what might have been a wave. I sat by that small grave until sunset, holding that lock of hair, understanding that I'd just become keeper of the most dangerous secret in these mountains, proof that we weren't alone. Proof that the line between human and other was blurrier than anyone imagined. 3 days later, the government boots would appear. But in that moment, I was exactly where I belonged, guardian of the space between worlds, keeper of impossible truths, friend to the ones who were here first. The moment I unwrapped the grass bundle, my world shifted. The infant weighed maybe 4 pounds, its body a biological impossibility that my mind struggled to process. Fine, dark hair, covered skin that was neither pink nor brown, but something between. The skull extended backward slightly, not ape, not human, but suggesting both ancestries twisted together in ways that shouldn't exist. Duke whined from the porch, refusing to approach. Even dead, even this small, it triggered something primitive in him. The hands destroyed me, 5 perfect fingers, with tiny fingernails, but proportioned wrong. Fingers too long, palms too wide. Built for gripping branches, its mixed genetics would never let it reach. I'd seen death in Vietnam, seen children torn apart by weapons that shouldn't exist. But this was different. This was a mother trusting me with evidence that could destroy her entire species. The weight of that trust sat heavier than the small body in my arms. The burial took 3 hours. Military corners on the wool blanket, 21 stones around the grave, 1 for each year my son lived before dying in Khe Sanh. The flag folded perfectly, though I'd burn it later. Couldn't risk anyone finding it here, they watched from the trees. I felt all 3, though only shadows moved between trunks. When I played taps on my harmonica, something answered from the forest, a low, mournful harmony. Duke joined in, howling like his ancestors at the moon. For those minutes, we were all the same. Parents who'd lost children, creatures who understood grief. I mixed Catholic prayers with Cherokee blessings, my grandmother whispered when she thought no one was listening. Goey, rest. You were loved. You are mourned. Your journey was short, but you mattered. The female approached when I placed the last stone, 7 feet of primal power, moving like smoke through afternoon shadows. She knelt beside the grave, massive fingers tracing the stones with impossible gentleness. Tears tracked through the hair on her face. Thank, she managed. The word mangled by vocal cords never meant for human speech. Then harder. Baby safe now. Baby safe now. 3 words that shattered 17 years of careful distance. She wasn't just an animal. She was a mother who'd carried this child, felt it move, probably sang to it in whatever songs her kind sang. Now she trusted me to keep it safe, even in death. Oldtimer joined her, placed one hand on her shoulder. Comfort, support, shared grief, rendered in a perfectly human gesture. He looked at me, and in those ancient eyes I saw recognition. We both knew what this meant. The line had been crossed. The juvenile crept closer, reached toward the grave, then pulled back. Its mother made a soft sound, almost a lullaby, and it relaxed against her leg. They stayed until sunset, keeping vigil. When they finally left, melting back into the forest, the female looked back once. In that look was everything: gratitude, trust, and terrible vulnerability. She'd shown me their deepest secret. Now I was bound to them by something stronger than 17 years of trading. I was keeper of their grief, guardian of proof that we weren't alone, protector of the impossible truth that the line between human and other had already been crossed. 3 days later, Duke woke me at dawn, growling at the driveway instead of the forest. Boot prints in the mud, military grade, deep tread, 4 sets. They'd circled the cabin in the night, photographed tracks, documented everything. Professional, methodical, dangerous. The knock came at 7 sharp. 3 men in unmarked fatigues, no insignia, no names. The leader was 40, weathered face, dead eyes that had decided caring was weakness. "Mr. Coulter?" "I'm Johnson. We need to talk." They didn't wait for permission. Duke backed into the corner, recognizing threats he couldn't understand. Johnson's eyes cataloged everything, stopped on the woven grass basket, still on my table. Interesting artifact, local, indigenous, Cherokee, my grandmother's. He smiled, like we were sharing a joke. "Your property has unusual wildlife patterns, large mammals, undocumented movement corridors, bears, elk. It's the mountains, bipedal tracks, tool use, structured offerings." He pulled out a tablet showing infrared satellite footage. 3 heat signatures moving through forest, clear as day. "We've been monitoring for 18 months. My blood went cold. They'd known, all this time. We're not here to harm them," Johnson continued. "We're researchers, conservationists, but we need genetic samples, proof of breeding populations. For their protection," lies wrapped in half-truths. Same tone I'd heard in Vietnam when they talked about winning hearts and minds while loading napalm. Whatever was in that bundle, yes, we have long-range photography, was never viable. Infant mortality in hybrid populations exceeds 90%. But the genetic information could help us understand, maybe help them breed successfully. Help them breed. Like livestock, like experiments. "I don't know what you're talking about." Johnson walked to the window facing the forest. "The genetic anomalies we're tracking suggest something remarkable. Parallel evolution. Or perhaps," he paused, "something older, something that's been here longer than we have. Get out, Mr. Coulter, get out." They left, but not before placing a typed note on my table. "Your cooperation ensures your continued residence on federal land. Your silence about our presence is assumed." That night, my ham radio erupted with encrypted transmissions. Fragments I could decode. Subjects located. Breeding pair confirmed. Juvenile, approximately 4 years. Await extraction protocol. Extraction, not study. Capture. I grabbed my pack, started for the door, but the tree knocks came first, urgent, panicked, from 3 directions. Then a sound I'd never heard, a scream almost human but pitched lower, carrying more rage than any human throat could produce. Through the window, lights blazed in the forest. Spotlights, laser sights, the full weight of human technology aimed at beings who'd stayed hidden for millennia. At the center, a family that had trusted me with their greatest secret, now surrounded because I'd been too weak to turn them away. The radio crackled again. Genetic anomaly confirmed. Sample retrieval priority. Inhabitants to be contained or eliminated. I understood then. The infant hadn't just been their child. It had been proof of something the government already suspected, something they'd been hunting, and I'd led them right to it. The exchange site looked like a war zone. Trees snapped in half. Ground torn up by heavy machinery. The twin Douglas firs that had marked our meeting place for 17 years reduced to stumps. The destruction was deliberate, purposeful a message, but it was the note nailed to the remaining trunk that made my hands shake. Official letterhead, no agency identified. Your cooperation in forgetting this matter ensures your continued residence. Further contact with undocumented wildlife will result in immediate federal prosecution. They'd been here all night. The tracks told the story, military boots everywhere, vehicle treads from something heavy, drag marks that made my stomach turn. But no blood. Whatever happened, they'd taken them alive. Duke found it first, whimpering by a fallen log. Old. Timer's gift from years ago, the woven chain that held my dog tags torn and trampled in the mud. I picked it up, the strange fiber still impossibly strong despite the damage. He'd fought here. The claw marks on surrounding trees went 12 feet up, deeper than any territorial marking, rage and desperation carved in wood. The radio equipment they'd left behind was sophisticated military-grade surveillance tech hidden in fake rocks, micro cameras in the trees. They'd been watching for months, maybe years. Every exchange documented, every gift cataloged. My friendship with Old Timer had been their roadmap. I spent 3 days searching, finding more evidence of the struggle. Tranquilizer darts, huge ones, meant for grizzlies or bigger. Tufts of hair caught on branches. The juvenile's small footprints, ending suddenly where something had grabbed it. The mother's tracks, showing how she'd tried to circle back, protect her young, before disappearing entirely. On the 4th day, I found Johnson waiting at my cabin. "They're safe," he said without preamble. "Relocated. Protected habitat. That's all you need to know. Where? That's all you need to know." He handed me papers. "Sign these. National security. You never saw anything unusual. Your uncle was eccentric. You've been alone up here, slowly going bush crazy. That's the story if anyone asks. I won't. Your military pension. Your VA benefits. Your social security. This cabin which sits on federal land. All contingent on your cooperation." His dead eyes found mine. "We've dealt with witnesses before, Mr. Coulter. Some cooperate. Others disappear. Heart attacks. Hunting accidents. So many ways to die in these mountains." I signed. What choice did I have? But as Johnson left, I made my own plans. The cassette recorder was old, but worked perfectly. 7 tapes, 90 minutes each. Everything documented. Testing, March 29th, 2004. My name is Frank Coulter, Sergeant. First class, retired. Serial number 5479321. What I'm about to record is true. I swear this on my son's grave and my father's memory. I told it all. Every detail from that first February night. The gifts, the exchanges, the slow building of trust. Old Timer's family, the infant burial, the government raid. Names, dates, coordinates. Everything someone would need to understand what had lived in these mountains and what we'd done to them. Between recordings, I destroyed evidence. Burned Roy's journals, though it killed me to do it. Melted down the hard drives with thermite I'd kept from my service days. Scattered the ashes of 17 years of documentation in the creek. If they came back, they'd find nothing but an old man's ramblings on tape. But Duke's collar that I prepared carefully, hollowed out a space in the thick leather, wrapped the tapes in plastic, sealed them with pitch, added a note in Cherokee that my grandmother had taught me. Symbols that looked decorative but spelled out truth inside. Find Patricia Moss. Trust her. On the 7th tape, I recorded my decision. I found their tracks yesterday. Fresh ones, leading to the cave system Roy marked as forbidden. They escaped. Some of them, at least. The government thinks they have them all, but they don't understand these mountains. Thousands of square miles of wilderness. Cave systems that go for miles underground. Places humans have never walked. I'm going to find them, warn them, help them disappear deeper. I've got supplies cached, maps of the old mining tunnels, knowledge of where the surveillance ends. I'm 71 years old. My wife is dead. My son is dead. My father's bones rest in these mountains. What's left for me in the human world? If you're hearing this, I'm either dead or I made a choice. The same choice my father might have made if he'd lived long enough. The choice to stand with those who were here first. To protect what shouldn't exist, but does. There's no monster in these mountains. There's a people. Ancient, careful, intelligent. We had a chance for something unprecedented. Contact, understanding, coexistence. We destroyed it with our fear and greed. Don't come looking for me. But remember, they were here first. They'll be here when we're gone. And maybe, if we're very lucky, they'll forgive us for what we've done. I sealed the collar, clipped it on Duke with extra food and water accessible. Then I followed the tracks into the caves, into the darkness, into a world older than America, older than human memory. Behind me, Duke would wait 3 days as trained, then find his way to town. He was a good soldier. He'd complete his mission. 2 months later, Duke appeared at Ranger Station 7. Patricia Moss found him at dawn, 30 pounds lighter, missing his left eye, collar intact but blood-stained. He collapsed at her feet. Mission complete. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, recognizing him immediately. She'd checked on Frank monthly since the Morrison case, knowing something was wrong when he'd stopped answering radio calls. The Cherokee symbols on the collar made her hands shake. Her grandfather had taught her those marks. Truth inside. Trust her. She'd heard him telling stories about the old families who knew secrets, who kept pacts with things in the forest, stories she'd dismissed until now. The cassette tapes were wrapped like sacred objects. She listened to them in her truck, doors locked, radio off. Frank's voice, steady and sure, destroying everything she thought she knew about these mountains. 3 days later, she drove to Frank's cabin, officially abandoned now, already being reclaimed by the forest. But fresh tracks circled the property. Massive bare feet, smaller ones, and between them, boot prints. Human boots. Frank's size. On the cabin wall, carved deep in Cherokee symbols with a translation underneath. They were here first. She stood there for an hour, holding those tapes, weighing duty against truth. Her report sat on the passenger seat. Frank Coulter, missing, presumed deceased by natural causes. No evidence of foul play. In the trees, something watched. She felt it like electricity on her skin. Not threatening, waiting. Patricia made her choice. She burned the report, hid the tapes in her grandfather's old chest, and filed paperwork stating Frank had died of a heart attack, body unrecovered. Case closed. Every winter since, she leaves supplies at the old exchange site. Food, medicine, blankets, they always disappear. Sometimes, things appear in return, herbs that cured her mother's arthritis, a carved wooden bear for her daughter, once a nugget of gold that paid off her student loans, and sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark, she sees them. A family moving through the trees. 4 of them now, 2 large, 1 medium, 1 small, and walking with them, slower but steady, a figure in worn military boots. Still protecting those here first.